In today's podcast, I've collected some common grammatical problems, and we're going to have a quick look at some of them. They're all of them short. I call them grammar black spots. They're problems that keep coming up repeatedly and that can be solved very, very simply. The first of them concerns the word data. Whether it's data or data is always an open question. Is data a singular or is it a plural? In other words, do we say, does the data show that, or do we say, do the data show, or the data show that? The reason for the confusion is that data is a Latin plural. The singular of the word is datum. No one uses the word datum in the sense that we use the word data. No one says that datum showed that such and such. We use it, data in that sense as a singular. No one says a data or a data either. It's almost universally used now as a singular, and it's okay to use it as a singular. It's similar to the word media, which is the plural of medium. We say now the media, it was reported in the media that, as though media were a singular. And in fact, in earlier transformations, the words agenda, for example, and stamina were also Latin plurals that we now use as singulars. So in other words, there's no problem using the word data as a singular. There may be occasions when it's appropriate to use it as a plural, for example in scientific or social scientific papers, for example, but generally not. The second problem that I wanted to look at in this grammar black spots podcast is fewer or less. When do we use the word fewer and when do we use the word less? This is one of the most common mistakes that we encounter, and it's a mistake that's very easily made and very easily corrected. Consider this sentence that I'm just about to read out to you. Less and less students turn up to class every week. Less and less students turn up to class every week. Is that correct? In fact, it should be fewer and fewer students turn up to class every week. And the reason that we know that it should be fewer and not less, and this is the rule of thumb, is that less refers to an amount or a quality. In other words, we say less than a kilogram, or we say it's less than satisfactory. Fewer will always refer to number. In other words, he's made fewer than 10 runs in every test match innings that he's played in the last 12 months. So if there's a number involved, you should be using fewer rather than less. The exception, of course, is when the number is connected to something else, as in $50. You know, 50 is a number, but you wouldn't say fewer than $50. You would say that costs less than $50, because it's really referring to an amount. It's not really referring to the number itself. Okay? Now, sometimes less may be grammatically correct, but in fact it's idiomatically awkward, or idiomatically it seems wrong. For example, you might say, I wish they'd sell that at a less price. In fact, you know, that's grammatically correct, but really we want to say, I wish they'd sell it at a lower price, not at a less price, because it seems quite wrong. And the other thing is the word lesser. I wish they'd sell it at a lesser price, and we know that that's totally incorrect. Lesser is a comparative adjective, and it only gets used when you want to say something like Wordsworth and Coleridge, who was the lesser poet of the two, where you want to know who was the least, or the less important, should I say, of the two poets. So that's the rule of thumb for fewer or less. One of the most problematic, or one of the most tricky grammatical black spots that I encounter in my reading is the difference in English between lay and lie, and this comes up an awful lot. It's a common mistake because lay and lie are, first of all, two different verbs. The verb to lay is a transitive verb. In other words, what we mean by that is you lay something else down. You lay something, you do it to something. In other words, you lay something down, you set it in place, you lay turf, you lay a tarpaulin over a trailer, whereas the verb to lie is a completely different word. It's an intransitive verb. You don't lie something, you lie down. You put your body in a horizontal position on the ground. So lay is a transitive, lie is an intransitive. Now the complication arises because of past tenses. You'll see a little table up on your screen now, and it'll show the way in which the tenses of these words work. The simple past tense of the word lay is laid. Okay? Caesar and his army laid waste to the entire town. And the past perfect tense, again, is laid. He had barely laid the new grass down when some idiot drove right over it. He barely laid the new grass down when some idiot drove right over it. Now, by contrast, the simple past tense of lie, confusingly, is lay. In other words, I lie down every day at 5 o'clock for a sleep. In the past tense, he lay down and wept. He lay down, in other words, in the past. So here, lay is not the transitive verb that we spoke about earlier. It's the past tense of the intransitive verb lie. Boy, that's confusing. And the past tense of lay there is lain. I have lain for a long time. I had lain for only about 4 hours. So it's good to get those in your mind, the difference between lay, the transitive verb, and lie. Or let's say the difference between lay, the transitive verb, and lay, the past tense of the intransitive verb, lie. So work on that one. Another big problem with grammar is whether to use which or that, whether to use which or what, whether to use who or whom, and how to use the word whose. These are all relative pronouns. The general rule of thumb, which refers to things, that refers to people and things, and who refers to people only. But it's not enough just to know that. You need to know when to use these relative pronouns properly. So the question you need to ask yourself, and I'm talking about which or that here, first of all, the question you need to ask yourself is, are you going to be adding a clause to a sentence that gives more information, but the sentence already makes sense without that added clause? Okay? Are you adding a clause to a sentence that gives more information to that sentence, but if you took that sentence out, it wouldn't make any difference to the sense of the sentence that's already there? So you're adding something on that's not necessary, but it adds more information. In that case, you would use the word which. Now, if your relative clause, that clause that you're adding, is absolutely necessary for the sentence to make sense, that's when you need to use that. And what we'll be doing here is having a look at some examples. So if you look on the screen now, I've got this simple sentence here. If you enjoyed Charles Dickens's David Copperfield, you'll love Oliver Twist. Now have a look at this sentence, which uses a relative clause. If you enjoyed David Copperfield, you'll love Oliver Twist, comma, which Dickens also wrote. Now I could take that which Dickens also wrote out, and it wouldn't make any difference to the sense of the sentence. If you enjoyed David Copperfield, you'll love Oliver Twist. In other words, you're talking to someone that already knows that both of those novels are by Charles Dickens. But if they don't know that Dickens also wrote Oliver Twist, you could add that explanatory clause just to give them a hand. So you just read David Copperfield, you really enjoyed it. Well, you should read Oliver Twist, which Dickens also wrote. And in that sense, that second clause doesn't need to be there in order to make the sentence make sense, and therefore you would use comma, which. But compare it with this sentence. If you enjoyed David Copperfield, you'll enjoy other novels that Dickens wrote too, such as Oliver Twist. Now in this sense, the clause is necessary. If you enjoyed David Copperfield, you'll enjoy other novels that Dickens wrote. In other words, we're not saying if you enjoyed David Copperfield, you'll enjoy other novels. That doesn't make any sense at all. If you enjoyed David Copperfield, you might enjoy other novels that Dickens wrote. And in that case, you need that, you don't need which. Okay? So that's necessary to the sentence. If you enjoyed David Copperfield, you'll enjoy other novels that Dickens wrote too, such as Oliver Twist. And finally, this example here, Charles Dickens, who is also the author of David Copperfield, wrote Oliver Twist. Now the thing is that writers are generally inclined to use the word which instead of the word that. And there are two rules of thumb. The first is go witch hunting in your writing. In other words, go through, particularly if you're editing, and see if which is being used where that should be used. Okay? And the way that you clarify that is in the way that I just told you, the distinction between which and that. And another way to check is to, as we saw in our first example there, which is most often preceded by a comma, because it's a clause that is not necessary. Okay? That is much more likely to be part of the sentence. So we have a look at another couple of examples here. Have a look at this one. The car that broke down on the freeway last week is still parked in the breakdown lane. The car that broke down on the freeway last week is still parked in the breakdown line. Now that's a way of saying, you know the car I mean, you know that one we saw, well, it's still there. Okay? In that sense, you have to use that because that clause, the car, the one that broke down, that's the clause that's relative to the car, is necessary to that sentence. That's why that should be there and not which. Now compare it to this example, which is pretty much the same formulation. The car, which broke down on the freeway last week, is still parked in the breakdown lane. So there, you've got the car, and then you've got a parenthesis, which broke down on the freeway last week, is still parked in the breakdown line, is still parked in the breakdown lane. And that's as though you're answering a question, where is the car and why isn't it here? You're saying the car, which broke down on the freeway last week, as you remembered, is still parked in the breakdown lane because nobody's come and picked it up. Okay? In other words, where is the car? It's still parked in the breakdown lane. You could take out that which broke down on the freeway last week and still have a sentence that makes sense. The car is still parked in the breakdown lane. That's where you need your which. You wouldn't put that there. That would sound wrong. You'd say the car that broke down in the freeway. You would introduce that ambiguity. Quickly, which or what? Which wine would you like tonight? Is that what you say? Or you say, what wine would you like tonight? They're two different questions. Basically, if you say, which wine would you like tonight, you've probably got two bottles of wine in your hand, a bottle of red and a bottle of wine, and you're going, which wine would you like tonight? Okay, there's a choice of two. You know that there's a choice of two, and you're picking one. But if you're saying, what wine would you like tonight, you go, I might have some champagne, or I might have some white wine, I might have some red wine, I might have some French wine, I might have some Australian wine. That's the case in which you would use what and not which. Who or whom? Whom is one of those pronouns that almost no one uses now, and if you do use it, you feel slightly self-conscious about it, as though you're speaking in a way that is perhaps too formal or over-educated for almost any occasion, unless you precede the word whom with a preposition like to whom are you speaking, or about whom are you talking. The difference between who and whom is simply that who is the subject of a sentence and whom is the object of a sentence. Who is reading the book? Who is in the subject position? Whom should I say is calling? I am the subject of that sentence. Whom is the object? In other words, who are you and why are you calling? So whom is in the position of the object in the sentence, therefore you should say whom rather than who. But you know, another example would be the journalism students whom you met this morning all got distinctions for their work. The journalism students being the object of the sentence, you being the subject of the sentence in that case. And in general usage we would say the journalism students you met this morning, and you would just completely eliminate that problem of who or whom. So be aware of when you should be using who and when you should be using whom. The final relative pronoun is the possessive pronoun whose. And the only thing I wanted to say about this, and this is often a grammar spot, is that whose can refer to things as well as to people. And you often find writers getting into all kinds of tangles and tortuous configurations in order to avoid using the word whose. In other words, you could say, this is the person whose shoes were designed by Valentino, and that is referring there to a person. But you could also say, this is the car whose bodywork has inspired car designers for years. in which case you're talking about a car, a thing, you can still use the possessive relative pronoun whose in relation to things. It doesn't just relate to people. So that's an important rule to remember too. So these are just a handful of grammar problems that arise consistently in writing and that you as an editor should be aware of and that you need to school yourself in. So these are the grammar black spots. Watch out for them.